My name is YASHBIR ROHILLA, and today we are going to discuss few topics. These would be first Pashu Adhar, second would be inflation terms, because inflation is in the news and it has crossed its normal limits like CPI inflation 2 to 6% limit. It is now more than 6%, so it becomes very important. And the third topic would be FRBM Act, because of some recent target changes in the budget. And the last topic would be Punaura Dam. So without wasting time, we start our first topic for today, and it is Pashu Adhar. Pashu Adhar is a 12-digit UID, unique identification number. It aims enhancing traceability of livestock and their products. Livestock here means any animal which is used for milk for meat. It is also known as INAPH, Information Network for Animal Productivity and Health. It contains information about how much milk any animal is giving, and about the vaccination status, etc. of the bovine species. It would help in counting animals as well as in implementing programs like Animal Disease Control Program, Food and Disease Control Program. All these programs can be implemented in a better way after Pashu Adhar. And one more information about this is, it is developed by NDDB, National Dairy Development Board. This can be one part in the MCQs. They can give it like NDRI. It is developed by NDRI, National Dairy Research Institute, or NDDB. So UPSC can confuse us between NDRI and NDDB, National Dairy Development Board. And the right option would be National Dairy Development Board. With this, we go to our next topic, and it is regarding inflation. Here we are going to discuss few basic concepts of the inflation, and after that all the key terms related with the inflation, because they becomes very important nowadays. Every news article comes for the inflation targeting and inflation. What is CPI? What is WPI? Here briefly we will discuss basics of the inflation. If one has to define inflation, it is consistent, persistent rise in general prices of goods and services. It can be measured CPI at the consumer level as well as WPI at the wholesale level. Briefly, we will give few necessary points. CPI is measured by, let us divide CPI, various types of CPI. It can be divided in 4 subtypes: for agricultural labors, for rural labors, industrial labor, and CPI for the urban, rural, all India. All these different types of inflation target particular working group. In CPI, we study change in prices at the consumer level. Here the target consumer group is agricultural laborer, and here rural labor, and in IL industrial labor. All these three kind of inflation is calculated or published by Labor Bureau. Labor Bureau, Ministry of Labor. And the fourth one, CPI inflation. It is published by National Statistical Office, National Sample Organization, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. So I think CPI is complete here. According to Monetary Policy Committee, CPI should be between 2% to 4%. But in March 2022, it crossed its limit of 6%. It has become a 6.26%. So it has become a matter of concern for the government. That's why in recent time, our RBI raised repo rate by 0.4%. Why? To overcome the CPI inflation. And other type of inflation is WPI. In the WPI inflation, we measure change in prices of goods and services at the wholesale price, at the business wholesale level. So in current times, it is around 12% or more than 12%. It is calculated by Office of Economic Advisor. Office of Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance. Office of Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance. So I think we have covered basics of inflation here. Now we discuss key terms of the inflation one by one. First key term here is disinflation. It is reduction in the rate of inflation. For instance, by this graph we can understand inflation. This is positive side, this is negative side. And first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, and the fourth quarter. If inflation in the first quarter is like 4% and the second quarter is like 3%, then we call this reduction in rate of inflation as disinflation. Basically, we compare inflation of a particular month or quarter with the corresponding month or quarter of the previous year. But here I have just shown you, if it decreases and it remains on the positive side, we call it disinflation. It has not become negative. Only the rate of inflation has decreased from its earlier level. And the second key term here is deflation. Alternatively, we can call it negative inflation. In case of deflation, our net rate of inflation becomes negative. For instance, here -2%. But it shows fall in the general prices of goods and services. And if we compare disinflation and deflation, disinflation is positive and deflation is negative. It is the basic difference between disinflation and deflation. Next key term is creeping inflation. If the rate of inflation is up to 3%, we call it creeping. Walking, trotting, if the rate of inflation is between 3 to 7%. Similarly, for running or galloping, inflation rate would be more than 10%. And the next key term is runaway hyperinflation. Here, the rate of inflation is extreme, that is even more than 20-30%. If inflation is with the recession means slowdown in economic activity. With recession, we will discuss one more key term, depression. What is the difference between depression and recession? when there is contraction in the economic activity. We call it slowdown in the economic activity, and repression shows decrease in the rate of growth. Rate of growth for 2 consecutive quarters. For 2 consecutive quarters, if there is decrease in the economic activity, there is decrease in the GDP rate, we call it repression. For 2 consecutive quarters. When it continues and the economy contracts more than 10% of the GDP, accompanied by loss of employment or the rise of unemployment, we call it depression. Depression is the extreme form of repression. I think it is clear here. Contraction of more than 10% of GDP plus loss of employment. Plus loss of employment. We can remember the stagflation by stagnation plus inflation. Stagnation means stagnation in economic activity, and inflation we already know. When both combines, it becomes stagflation. Misery index, it is the rate of inflation plus rate of unemployment. Next keyword is inflationary gap. We need to first understand the term full employment. Full employment means every person of the workforce who is willing and able to work is able to find the job. We call that situation full employment. At the rate of full employment, when the aggregate demand exceeds the aggregate supply, what happens? There would be inflation. If the demand exceeds supply, then there are more buyers. If there are more buyers, then they are ready to pay more and more for the goods. So there would be inflation because of that. We call that inflationary gap. Next key term is deflationary gap. It is also at the full employment level. But what happens here? Aggregate supply is more than aggregate demand. When supply would be more, then there would be competition in the goods, and every manufacturer is ready to sell its goods at lower and lower prices because the buyers are limited for them. Because of that, the price level of the goods and services will fall, and how much that will fall? It is represented by deflationary gap. Next key term here is depressed inflation. In this inflation, the government becomes active participant. The government become active participant, and government tries to control price level. Becomes, we know when there would be inflation, when demand would be more than the supply. In that situation, government comes into action, and whatever the measures government takes in the form of fiscal policy, or RBI takes in the form of monetary policy, that would come under suppressed inflation. Next key term is open inflation. In the above situation, when the government does not control the inflation, we call this open inflation. What is core inflation? Core inflation means leaving apart volatile objects like food, fuel. Whatever the inflation is for other objects, we call that inflation core inflation. That is apart from volatile objects, food, fuel. Headline inflation, it covers all the goods. It is a basket of goods, for a basket of goods. Maximum number of baskets and goods are covered under headline inflation. Now, it is CPI in our country, Consumer Price Index. Structural inflation. It is because of structural problems like infrastructure. If there is a lot of hurdle in manufacturing anything, then by default its production will fall. If production will fall, its demand cannot be fulfilled, and because of that prices will be higher, and we call this kind of inflation as structural inflation. Next term is reflation. Reflation comes after inflation. When economy recovers from recession based on value of inflation. Economy works in the cycle of like growth, slowdown, and when there is slowdown and economy recovers from the slowdown because of government measures or government spending, and because of the government spending, growth takes, and because of that growth, inflation happens. We call that inflation reflation. Generally, we represent business cycle in the form of like this. This is highest growth, this is the lowest growth. When there is recession or depression, and when it becomes positive again because of government policies. Higher spending or lower taxes. Then growth regains, and because of this growth, there is some inflation. We call that inflation as reflation. With this, we go to our next topic, and this is regarding Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act 2003. The chief aim of this act was to institutionalize financial discipline. It was enacted by our parliament in 2003. Financial discipline means to control spending, expenditure of the government with its revenue. If there is more expenditure, then there will be more fiscal deficit, and it is not good in the long term. So with this act, there are certain documents which the government is required to put on the floor of the parliament as a measure of accountability. How is the progress for the indicators and the fiscal matters. Since the act was primarily for the management of the government's behavior, it provided certain documents to be tabled in the parliament annually. And what are these documents? It requires tabling of 4 documents. And the first one is medium-term fiscal policy statement. Second is fiscal policy strategy. This is fiscal policy strategy. This is fiscal policy statement. There is a difference between medium-term fiscal policy statement and fiscal policy strategy. This fiscal policy strategy, this is the way how the government is going to tax or do expenditure for the programs. And here policy means government sets rolling target for the 3 years with different fiscal indicators. Fiscal indicators here taken into account are 4 indicators, 4 fiscal indicators. And the first one, revenue deficit. second fiscal deficit, and the third one tax revenue, and last one is total outstanding liabilities as a percentage of GDP. Under medium term fiscal policy, government have to furnish all these 4 indicators, and different targets are set for the 4 indicators with timely reporting to the parliament. This is a way to bring accountability of the executive to the parliament. We discussed fiscal policy strategy. It is a strategy for the upcoming financial year regarding fiscal priorities, taxation policy, key fiscal measures, and an evaluation of how the proposed policy of the central government conform to the fiscal management principles. And the third document would be Macroeconomic Framework. It is a kind of forecast. It is a kind of forecast, prospects of the growth, how much GDP will grow, what would be the inflation, what would be the BOP. It shows the stability, overall stability of the economy. And the last document is medium-term expenditure framework statement. In this 3-year rolling target for prescribed expenditure is given. For different indicators, we discussed 4 indicators: fiscal deficit, revenue deficit, total outstanding liabilities. This is provided under section 6. This can be one statement in MCQs. Under section 6, medium term expenditure framework is given for how many years? For 3 rolling years. With this is required by the government to furnish every year. But if government is not able to fulfill the targets set in the FRBM Act, then it has to give answer in the parliament. But government can change the targets in few situations. These are national security, natural calamity, and other exceptional grounds. But the central government is required in the exceptional grounds case to provide reasons for not implementing the targets. And both houses of the parliament is required to consider that they were approved, because it requires approval of both the houses. Once the government put its reasons in the house, and if it approves, the government has to stick with the measures it is going to take, like fiscal tightening or fiscal stimulus, whatever the government tries to do for a particular year. For instance, in the COVID years, government exceeded its target because of the extraordinary situation created by the pandemic. So in such cases, government can breach the targets of the FRBM Act. In 2016, government announced a committee to review the FRBM Act under the leadership of N.K. Singh as its chairman. N.K. Singh was then Revenue Secretary, to set the new target for the FRBM Act. For the year 2022-23, government has set a target of fiscal deficit 6.4% of the GDP. Now our fiscal deficit is around 6.7%. But what government requires to bring it down to 6.4% to the end of the year, and up to 4.5% by the end of the year 2025 to 26. With this, we go to our last topic of today, Punaura, Dham. Why this is in news? Because in recent time, government included Punaura, Dham under its Swades Darshan scheme and Prasad scheme. Swades Darshan scheme and Prasad scheme. It is a temple of Ma Janki Devi. Ma Janki here means Ma Sita It is situated in Sitamarhi district of Bihar. It is the key point to remember because they can ask it, where is Punaura Dham? It is in Sitamarhi district of Bihar. It is related with the Ma Sita of Ramayana. Prasad scheme was initiated in year 2014-15 to improve or to develop infrastructure at the pilgrimage site. Similarly, Swades Darshan was also the similar scheme, but it focused on developing circuit-based tourism, Ramayana circuit, Buddhist circuit, by making a network of the related religious circuit, religious pilgrimage sites. These are some measures which are taken under these schemes in the Bihar. You can have a glance over this. Friends, with this, we end our today's topic. I hope you understood. These were few recent cases where UPSC can ask you questions. So, we will meet you next time with another topic or few other recent current affairs. Thank you very much.